Majesty, the Sorcerer and the Saint. Jack sat at the dinner table dressed in black. Black t-shirt, black pants, black socks and black combat boots. As usual, the clothes made a definite statement. Jack was never prepared to say what that statement was exactly, but it was clear his clothes had become a kind of uniform. He was also the only one at the table with black hair. Everyone else had hair that was brown and rested on their head in a normal fashion, while Jack's hair stood straight up. Aside from that, and the ear ring which Mom and Dad were thankful was in Jack's ear and not somewhere else, Jack looked relatively normal. Mom and Dad smiled at each other and tried not to stare. Katie said grace and blessed the food, while Sophie sat in her high chair and provided plenty of entertainment. She pounded her spoon in protest, and as dinner progressed, she squished handfuls of creamy vegetables between her fingers and plastered gobs of it on her face. "Very good," Mom said when the baby managed to actually get some in her mouth. Katie laughed at the mess she was making while Jack winced and did his best not to look. The conversation was light. There was talk of the day's activities, what Dad had done at work, the antique table Mom bought at the store, Katie's kite and the A on her spelling test. Jack watched them all suspiciously and waited. Just then, Sophie stopped wrestling with her food long enough to point at Jack with her sloppy spoon and laugh. She laughed so hard she chuckled and snorted, then looked Jack straight in the eye, which made his hair stand up even straighter. It was as though she knew what was happening, and that no amount of magic or wizardry could possibly get him out of this situation. Jack glared back at her, then looked around the table. Whatever was going to happen, he would just have to sit still and ride it out. Then, in the middle of a second helping, Dad made the announcement. "Well, I've got something to tell you," he said. "What is it?" Katie asked excitedly. "Is it the picnic? Is it?" she said, and could hardly sit still. Jack frowned and thought, "Don't be silly. This is about me, not some stupid picnic." He looked at Katie from the corner of his eye. It was all he could do to keep from reaching over and putting his hand over her mouth. "Maybe?" Dad said, then smiled and leaned forward to look at Katie with a raised eyebrow. "How did you know?" Katie jumped out of her chair. "I knew it! I knew it!" she yelled. "Tomorrow is Saturday, and it's going to be warm and sunny. It'll probably be the last good day of the year. Can we have the picnic tomorrow? Please? It'll be great. I promise." "Last good day of the year, huh? What do you think, honey?" Dad said. Mom nodded as though it might not be a bad idea. "I guess so," Mom said. "You could even try out your new kite, unless of course you've got other plans." Dad suddenly looked surprised and disappointed. "You don't have other plans, do you?" Katie smirked, then grinned at the question while Jack just stared. That was it? All that worrying for nothing? So much for Wizard's intuition. Jack breathed a sigh of relief and finally relaxed while they talked. Now that dinner was over, all he had to do was wait to be excused. Jack sat with his chin propped on his hand and looked away at the blue lamp with the pink shade on the side table. The lamp was a rich dark blue, the perfect color for a wizard's robe. The pink glow of the lampshade reminded Jack of what was commonly known as wizard's fire, the glow that came from a wizard's hand when he successfully cast a spell, which was something Jack had not yet managed to do, nor had any other human since the days of Merlin. "Jack," Dad said for the third time. The boy jumped and was a little annoyed that he had to come back to their boring conversation. "What?" Jack said. "The picnic?" Dad asked, as though Jack should have an opinion, since they had been talking about it for the last 5 minutes. "Oh, yeah, cool," Jack said, sounding totally disinterested, and just nodded while Dad stared at him and frowned. The moment of truth had come, and Jack had hardly noticed. There was a rather lengthy pause, during which time Dad looked at Mom. Mom smiled at Dad, and Dad nodded. Mom nodded back, and Dad raised an eyebrow, to which Mom shrugged and frowned back. Jack looked back and forth at the two of them, like he was watching a tennis match. But since this wasn't nearly as much fun, he pushed his chair back and promptly asked to be excused. "Wait," Dad said. Mom and Dad suddenly looked frantic, blinking and nodding back and forth, this time with a little more English and top spin. Katie had never seen her parents act so strangely. They snarled and grumbled like two spoiled children fighting to get their way. "Mom? Dad?" Katy said, but her parents only ignored her. "You! No, you! No, you!" is all they said with their blinking eyes, jerking heads and twitching lips. Although they had both agreed that the time had come to talk to the boy about everything, the books, the magic, his fascination with wizardry, and all the weird behavior in general, neither one could bring themselves to even say a word. The two were hopelessly engaged in a grueling contest of face-making and head-jerking with no end in sight. And so with that, Jack simply left the table, plodded upstairs and retreated back to his room. When he was gone, Mom and Dad stared at each other dumbfounded, like partners in a doubles match who had just watched an ace go right down the middle. "You!" Dad said, pleading with his arms outstretched. "Me? I thought you," Mom said in her own defense. The two were terribly confused, and although neither one could even begin to explain what had happened, there was in fact a very good explanation. But since it involved unseen creatures with supernatural powers that had invaded their home to steal their children, neither one of them had a clue. While Mom and Dad were still glaring at each other, the baby sat in her high chair, perfectly still with food on her face and her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The infant hardly blinked. Her gaze was so intense Katy looked up as well, but saw nothing. The baby stared unafraid at the tiny demonic creature floating near the ceiling, peering down at them from its non-existent perch. The mischievous spirit was no bigger than a wrinkled old shoe and looked just as pitiful. It sat with its arms drawn up in front of it, with eyes as black as polished marbles. It was this wicked little imp that had brought fear and confusion and helped Jack to escape. Now that its job was done, it no longer paid attention to Katy's mom or dad. Its eyes were fixed on the children. The devilish creature was afraid and nearly trembled, not because it was unveiled and could clearly be seen by the infant, but because the imp absolutely hated children that glowed. The thin layer of light that covered Katy and her sister radiated from their bodies and shone brightly through their clothes. The creature peered at the light and trembled, for every minion of darkness knew that any child that glowed was a child of God, and that meant there was a guardian nearby. When the imp had seen enough, it wasted no time and quickly turned aside as though it had been called away, then dove through the wall to escape. Once it was gone, Sophie thrust her spoon at the ceiling, flicking bits of food into the air, then turned to Katy, wide-eyed, and yelled, "Daba!" which meant, "What was that?" The baby stared at her, waiting for a response, but Katy got goosebumps instead and shivered. Chapter 2. What's so big about magic? Jack rushed to his room, then closed the door behind him and breathed a sigh of relief. It was a narrow escape, and he smiled to himself, totally unaware that he was still being watched. Without a sound, a dozen little creatures crept through the walls like living shadows, invisible monsters, black-hearted imps and pointy-horned urchins. They hunched under withered wings and gathered around the demonic little creature that had returned from the dining room. "It saw me! It saw me!" The tiny imp squeaked and trembled as it chattered on nervously when a tired and reluctant voice moaned from the shadows. "Who saw you?" The imp cried out. "The little one and the child, they glowed, they glowed. We dare not leave this chamber, or it will find us." The demonic spirits huddled together under the watchful gaze of their leader. The only one who didn't seem the slightest bit worried, a green-eyed, hook-nosed goblin that stood 3.5 feet tall. The goblin, Numlock, sat atop Jack's bookshelf in plain view, looking as defiant as ever, and glared at the boy as Jack went about his business. He hated this place, and the task he had been given. In short, the goblin hated humans, and was not afraid to say so. "Humans! Bah!" he snarled through pointed yellow teeth. The imps and urchins stopped their seething long enough to listen. "What are you afraid of? These bottomless barrels, bags of bones, worthless wonks, the lot of them. No magic in them, no magic at all. What good are they?" the goblin snarled. The imp fluttered up on bat-like wings and cried out, "But the guardian! "The Guardian!" he screeched. "Hang the Guardian!" shouted Numlock and swiped at the tiny imp. The creature quickly darted back into the shadows, panting in fear. Numlock turned his back and rubbed his stubby beard as he observed the boy. Jack was chanting again, sitting crossed-legged on his bed, and happened to be flicking his fingers at something on the floor. Numlock groaned and could barely be bothered. He climbed down off the shelf and made his way across the room. There was so much junk scattered around, the goblin didn't know what Jack was looking at or what he was trying to do. Amidst the clutter was an old book. It was worn with a tattered cover, and Numlock guessed that was it. Since it was his job to encourage the boy and keep him happy, the invisible goblin reached down and gave the book a gentle tap. The book barely moved, but Jack's eyes lit up in utter amazement, even though it was not the focus of his attention. The truth was, he was trying to move the object next to the book, an old baseball with ragged stitching that was brown with age. But when the book moved instead, Jack focused all of his efforts on that. He hopped off his bed, lit a candle and hunkered down over the book in the flickering light, then strained as hard as he could to use his magic powers, but it was hopeless. Numlock had done his duty and the book would not move again. The goblin watched the boy with growing resentment and thought back on the events that had led up to him being sent here. It was still fresh in his evil mind, like it was only yesterday. Numlock growled at the memory. The order had come from Marplot, great high sorcerer of the Wizards' Grand Council, and the most powerful wizard of all the Nor world. At 2,943 years of age, Marplot was also the oldest wizard in the Nor world, and quite a pathetic sight. He was so thin and worn, his long grey beard weighed more than he did. Too frail to walk, the feeble old wizard floated from place to place like a ghost in his Grand Council chair, with his little goblin servants chasing after him wherever he went. Still no wizard dared challenge Marplot, for his power was far too great. When his eyes failed and Marplot was blind, he trained his hands to see, and used his magic to read the ancient scrolls by mere touch. Although the doddering old wizard was nothing to look at, he was really quite famous. It was widely known that when Marplot was a young wizard and had risen to power, he conspired with demons and joined in a plan to wage war against God. In that day the battlefield was Earth. The Son of God had dared to become mortal and stood before man, alone and without his angels. The wizards and demons joined forces and used their powers to turn the minds of men against the Lord of Glory. And when they had put the Saviour to death, Satan and his demons rejoiced to see the Son of God, betrayed by men and hung on a cross, but the battle was not yet won. Marplot was only one soldier in the army of darkness, but still he remembered the day the angel came down from heaven and stood atop the empty tomb to proclaim that he who once was dead was now alive forevermore and had saved all mankind from certain destruction. The angel's words were like a hammer that smashed the gates of hell and declared the glory of God. With the victory won and the Son of God seated upon the throne, Satan and his demons were defeated, and the wizards of the Nor world were all made to look like fools. That was over 2,000 years ago, and Marplot could not forget the past which haunted him. He toiled in bitter envy, seeking revenge, but he would have to wait upon the Lord. He would have to wait until Christ's return. The problem was no one knew the day or the time. Marplot searched his books on sorcery and went through his entire library. He searched the writings of the early mystics, writings on ancient history. He even searched the Holy Scriptures, which was a difficult thing for a wizard to do. To a sorcerer, the word of God was like a dagger in the flesh, but Marplot would bear any pain to learn the secret of the Lord's return. Try as he might, the answer was nowhere to be found. In truth, it was a secret that God kept well hidden, which made Marplot all the more determined to find it. He did, however, manage to stumble across something fascinating. The Holy Scriptures mentioned the word children nearly 2,000 times. It seemed that God had a special interest in children, and that alone was enough to make Marplot suspicious. Why was God so concerned with children, he wondered. Did they know something about God no one else did? If so, perhaps one of them held the answer to the secret he was searching for. Century after century, he studied the minds of children and discovered they did indeed hold special knowledge. He also discovered that the knowledge faded with time, which he felt had something to do with innocence that went away as children grew older. Over the years, Marplot learned many things from the children. He learned that God loved daisies more than any other flower. That's why there were so many of them. He learned that your smile was connected to your heart. If you had a good smile, you had a good heart. If you had an evil smile, you had an evil heart. Anyone with a good smile and an evil heart was truly wicked and would be found out eventually. Since Marplot had no smile at all, he chose to ignore that information entirely. One child knew that dogs could see angels and barked because angels were so bright and shiny. What that had to do with God, the wizard didn't know. There was a lot of this kind of information which Marplot considered useless, but every once in a while he came across a child who knew something really interesting. For instance, one child knew that angels could indeed be tempted. The wizard made a note of that. Another child knew that goodness was stronger than evil. Marplot disagreed but made a note of that as well. Then there was the infant that smiled all the time. Her parents called her a happy baby. The truth was, the infant remembered heaven and could still see it clearly from the comfort of her crib. Her parents never suspected. Another child knew that every single person believed in God, even if they didn't care to admit it. This kind of information was interesting, but hardly what Marplot was looking for. Then there was the rare instance when he came across a child with really incredible knowledge, things that were truly astounding. These children were 1 in a billion. Marplot remembered the little 5-month-old baby who knew exactly what the throne of God looked like and what it was made of. 100 years later, there was an 8-month-old infant named Trudy who knew why God made the universe so big. The baby understood it with perfect clarity, but the matter was simply beyond the wizard's ability to grasp. 50 years later, he came across a child who knew the purpose of dreams, which the wizard found very interesting. Marplot had to wait another 135 years before he met the child who actually came close to the knowledge he was seeking. It was a little boy who was only 2 years old, and he knew why God was going to judge the world. The problem was, he didn't know when. Still, Marplot was encouraged by the information and kept searching. He continued to search the minds of children for another 457 years without so much as one piece of interesting information. Then one eventful day, the wizard Marplot came across a peculiar little girl. At 4 years of age, this child knew the names of the 12 apostles and could recite the 10 Commandments. Admittedly, this information was readily available to anyone with a Bible, but this child knew such facts about God at an age when most children were more concerned with games and toys. This caused the wizard to look more closely, and when he did, he shouted, "K.T. Campbell!" The feeble old wizard announced to the Grand Council in his quivering voice. "I have found you at last," he yelled. "She is the one. She knows the way. Find her, and you will find Majesty." Of course, at the time, no one knew who or what Majesty was until Marplot explained. "This is the key," he croaked from underneath his matted beard. "The horse of power and glory will bring him back to reign over all the kingdoms of all the worlds. Find the horse, and we will have power over heaven itself. We can stop the Lord's return." The girl was considerably older now, and since her innocence was slipping away, there was a fair amount of debate as to what to do next. There was talk of sending an army of ogres to quickly fetch the child, but the council decided on a more subtle approach, since an army of ogres walking the earth would attract more attention than they needed. Not to mention, the child would most likely be guarded by an angel. With that in mind, the Grand Wizards set about the task of studying the girl to learn everything they could about her. Most felt it was all useless, really. The little girl was far too old. At 12 years of age, what little knowledge of God left inside of her was less than a glint in her mind and fading fast. Indeed, they would have to move quickly if they were to get anything out of her at all, but even this was a delicate matter. The knowledge of God was a very dangerous thing, and getting it would not be easy. Like a serpent trying to avoid the sharp quills of a porcupine, it called for great skill and cunning. They found it peculiar that such a special child of God should be born to average people like Scott and Elaine Campbell, two powerless humans with no particular interest in God or his kingdom. But it wasn't until they discovered the boy that they considered his curious mind and were able to devise a plan. For the most part, they argued about the best way to use the boy and what sort of trap to lay for his sister. Then they argued about the wrath of God to come as a result of it all, and spent a great deal of time on that. That's when Numlock's master stepped forward and offered a suggestion. "Perhaps it would be better for all if the child came to us," he said. The council approved the idea and placed the matter entirely in his hands, and thus, before Numlock knew it, he had been thrust out of his world and sent to Jack's room with the instructions to stay there until the job was done. And here he was, loathing every minute. When Numlock looked at the boy, he was sitting on the floor staring at the book in a sulk. The goblin wagged his head, then growled and turned away. It was time for him to see where the girl was. The imps and urchins watched the goblin cross the room, then shrank back when he passed through Jack's door like a vapor and ventured into the hall. Numlock leapt into the air and crouched on the upstairs banister like an ugly cat. He glanced around nervously, then raised his head and sniffed. There was an essence of something, a sweet fragrance in the air that he recognized. "Yuck!" he belched. The guardian was nearby and he could smell him. Numlock snarled. He hated his master for making him do all the hard work, and hated him even more for putting him in such a perilous position. Still, guardian or no, he would stand his ground and do his job. His fiendish green eyes peered downstairs as he watched the child of God. Katie was all aglow as she hugged her mom and dad. They kissed her golden face and spoke to her with soft, reassuring voices, filled with love and caring. It was all too sickeningly sweet for the goblin to bear, and when the little girl turned and started up the steps toward him, Numlock glared at her in surprise, rounded in horror and retreated back to Jack's room. Once inside, he poked his head through the door to see where the child would go. Katie walked to her room, and when she opened the door, Numlock pulled back, shielding his eyes from the blinding light coming from within. The goblin watched as Katie went inside and closed her door, without any care for the light beaming all around her. Then, when the hall was darkened once more, Numlock gripped his dagger and growled. For the light that came from Katie's room could only have been made by one thing: a ministering spirit, a defender of the throne, an angel of the Lord. Numlock sneered and knew he had found the guardian. Katie's room was nicely decorated. It was brightly colored. There were dolls and cute stuffed animals. It was all neat and pleasant, with the exception of the 7-foot angel standing in the middle of her room radiating light like the sun. The angel floated off the ground and took up so much space. His head scraped the ceiling and his wings barely fit inside her room. His silver eyes were aglow, as was his entire body. The angel was lovely to look at. But if Katie could have seen this warrior of God draped in white robes smiling down on her, she would have been absolutely startled out of her wits. The fact that he was a protector of the innocent, sent by God to keep her far from evil, would have brought little comfort, especially with a host of imps, urchins, and a hook-nosed goblin living in the room just down the hall. Katie took her seat by the window, and the angel turned to watch her. His wings cast silvery sparks as they swept through the walls, and he gazed down upon the child. He could feel her emotions stirring. The strange goings-on at the dinner table had left Katy feeling unsettled and out of sorts, and the more she thought about it, the more it disturbed her. Then there was her brother, who was acting stranger than usual, and this upset her as well. Katy had to admit she was having a lot of thoughts lately that were upsetting. Then she remembered something her Nana used to say. "When troubles start to come your way, wait to worry and start to pray." "Wait to worry and start to pray. More pearls of wisdom," Katy whispered, then climbed down off the window seat and got down on her knees. She folded her hands and bowed her head, then closed her eyes. The angel knelt down beside her and folded his huge wings. The only official prayer Katy knew was the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm. Aside from that, she usually just talked to God and told him what was on her mind. Katy had to think a moment, and when she was ready, she spoke softly with a tenderness in her voice that was both sweet and respectful. It was a simple prayer from the heart of a child that made the angel smile. Then, with a polite "Amen," she hopped to her feet. Katy tended to keep her prayers short and to the point, since she figured that God was busy and had far more important things to do. Still, she was so confident in the power of prayer, she simply had to go see if Jack was any different. The angel rose quickly to get out of her way and watched Katy march to the door. When Katy reached Jack's room, she peeked inside. It was darker than usual. Katy's first thought was, maybe I should have prayed for Jack's room instead. She knocked and wished she hadn't. It was a weak little knock that tried not to attract any attention to itself. Katy could see Jack hunched over his large play table that was shoved in a corner. The boy glanced over his shoulder, then turned back around, which was the usual greeting. Katy wouldn't have minded a bit if Jack had actually gotten up and helped her across the room, but she knew that was too much to hope for. The room was watching Katy, and she could feel it. She stiffened slightly and tried to find the courage to tell the room to mind its own business, but it was hard enough just walking across the darkened floor that was littered with clothes and other things she could hardly make out. The ugly goblin glared down at her from on top of Jack's bookshelf. Katy could feel his icy gaze as she passed by and looked around her. The moment she took her eyes off the floor, she tripped and stumbled, then paused to see where she was going. When she did, the devilish imps crept out of the dark to surround her like a pack of wolves. They gloated with hungry eyes and licked their pointy horns with long black tongues that curled out of their mouths like shiny ribbons. Red claws clicked and glinted in the dark as they threatened to devour her delicious innocence. The fiendish creatures were still churning with hideous delight and wicked pleasure when the huge angel walked in behind Katy and filled the room with light. The perfect light of God was the last thing the little monsters ever expected to see in Jack's room. With a shriek and a howl, evil scattered in every direction, like cold water splashing out of a hot pan. It jumped into books and ducked inside boxes. Imps and urchins darted back and forth, bumping into each other, then dove through the walls like terrified shadows. The light hit Numlock so hard it knocked him off his perch atop the bookshelf and sent him crashing to the floor. One look at the Guardian, and the goblin scrambled to his feet as quick as he could, then lunged head first and slid under a pile of clothes where he waited and trembled. The evil creatures made lots of noise fleeing for cover, but none of it made a sound to human ears, nor did Katy or Jack see the light of the angel. The room was just as dark as ever, but with evil in hiding and the invisible angel towering over her, Katy felt much better. She crossed the room and came up behind Jack. In front of him was what used to be his train set. Now a medieval landscape took up the entire surface of the table, miniature and perfect to the slightest detail. There were hills with miniature trees and bushes, and a miniature stone castle, wonderfully constructed in the middle of it all. Below it was a stream of real water that flowed under a little stone bridge that Jack had made. The pump was well hidden, and the water flowed around tiny rocks that looked like boulders next to the little castle. In the dim blue light of his desk lamp, it all looked quite real. The castle was called Bathenoir, a name Jack found in a book. Baithenwa meant refuge, which seemed to fit, since he spent so much of his time sitting there, dreaming about magic and fighting magical battles. Below the stone bridge was the Black Knight with grim mace held high. He was trapped by a dragon perched on a ledge just above. The monstrous beast was poised, reared back on its hind legs, with wings spread apart and huge jaws gaping wide. The Black Knight's armor would offer little protection. One blast of the dragon's fiery breath and the dark warrior would be reduced to ashes. Katy peered over Jack's shoulder with some interest, but all she saw were toys. The knight was a little plastic figure painted black. The dragon was 12 inches long, made of rubber, with cloth wings. Katy watched as Jack reached across ever so slowly and moved a little bronze wizard into position behind the dragon. The bronze figure was no bigger than a chess piece and finely polished. Then, with his thumb and forefinger on the little wizard, Jack prepared to make his move when Katy asked, "What are you doing?" Jack cringed. The question affected him as always, like fingernails on a chalkboard. He paused and spoke slowly, never looking away from his toys. "I'm about to cast a spell," he whispered. Katy just stared. By the looks of things, her prayers had not been answered. But since she had already come this far and managed to brave the cruel darkness of Jack's room, she decided she might as well see what she could do on her own. "So what's so big about magic? None of it's real, you know," Katy said. Jack winced again and tried to speak as calmly as he knew how. "Why don't you just go back to your room, okay, kid?" he said smugly, just to show her who was boss. "And there's no such thing as wizards either," Katy added. Jack finally turned and glared at her. "What do you know?" "You're just a girl," Jack said, jeering at her. Katy shrugged, determined to make her point. "I know that wizards and dragons don't exist and magic isn't real. It's all just a bunch of phony tricks," she said, sounding very sure of herself. "Oh, yeah? And I suppose that God and his cutesy angels and all that stuff you read in the Bible is supposed to be real, right?" "Of course," Katy said. "Everybody knows that." Jack rubbed his hand across his face. "That's it," he said, then grabbed his sister by the arm. Jack walked across the room with Katy stumbling and bumbling along behind him, and when they reached the hall he placed her outside, then slammed the door in her face and locked it. Thinking that was that, Jack turned around and stood toe-to-toe with the warrior of God, a 7-foot angel that could hardly be described as cutesy. The glowing guardian glared down at Jack with fiery eyes that had seen the defeat of the Persian army and the fall of the Roman Empire. The angel sneered at the boy's rude behavior, looked away, then stormed out of the room, taking his light with him. As soon as the angel was gone, Numlock crept out from under the pile of clothes to see if the coast was clear. Jack had already gone back to his table when the rest of the devilish creatures slowly came out of hiding. They looked around rather sheepishly at first, then began to elbow each other and nod their approval as one of the creatures came forward. "He did it! He sent it away! This one will do well in our world," the imp said and squealed with delight. The devilish minions and urchins clapped and cheered for the human boy, but Numlock remained silent and his eyes turned cold. "It is the child of God they want. This one will never survive in our world. The boy is only human," the goblin sneered. Outside of Jack's room there was a sign on his door that read, "Keep out." Another sign, scribbled in red marker, was exactly the perfect height for Katy to read, and shouted its message loud and clear. "No babies allowed." Katy just pouted at it. "Katy, are you all right?" Mom called up from downstairs. "Yeah, I'm okay," Katy said with a sigh. This was not the first time she had found herself in the hallway outside of Jack's room and stood there, thinking. Her prayers had not worked out the way she wanted them to. Then it came to her, a thought that was more of a question, and standing there in the hallway, it was begging to be answered. Katy asked herself, what does Jack like more than anything in the whole world? That's easy, she told herself. He loves magic. She remembered how Jack would go on and on, whether she wanted to hear it or not, about every mythical creature imaginable. He talked about fairies that could see into your heart. He talked about dwarfs that could build anything as fast as you could think of it, or ogres that were too stupid to build anything at all. Ogres were mean and big as bulls. They carried tree stump clubs, rusted axes, and wandered through the woods without enough sense to get out of the rain. "You'd be mean too if you were that stupid," was Jack's conclusion. Her next thought was directed to herself. What do I like as much as Jack likes magic? It was a good question, and the answer came to her as quick as a flash. I like God. She didn't know as much about God as Jack knew about magic, but that was okay. God made her just as happy. That's when it occurred to her. Jack wasn't happy at all, not in her opinion. She couldn't even remember the last time she saw him smile. Perhaps that was the answer. Jack knew everything about magic, but as far as she could tell, it didn't make him happy. In fact, lately he was looking pale and sick with worry. The more she thought about it, the more obvious it became to her. If Jack was going to get better, something had to be done. Katie glared up at her brother's door with her invisible angel standing behind her, taking up a ridiculous amount of space in the hallway. "God is more important than magic," she declared. "And I'm going to make you understand, whatever it takes," Katie said with a frown, then plodded back to her room. By the time she climbed into bed, she was feeling much better about everything, and with her head nestled on her pillow, she closed her eyes and went to sleep. The angel stood next to the bed and put his hand on the golden hilt of his sword. As an angel, his presence was enough to make Katie's room a stronghold, a tower of strength against evil. Even Jack had only been able to get as far as Katie's door and no further. But with Katie's own words, she had issued a challenge that would lead her straight into danger. As her guardian, he could protect her, but had no authority over her free will, and in such matters could not interfere. Standing there, he could sense the powers of darkness growing in the house and even in the world around him. The angel looked down on Katie. For now she was safe in her room. Then, with one last look around, the guardian disappeared into a speck of light and was gone. Chapter 3. The Chase. By 9 o'clock Saturday morning, the family was packed in their little gold van and on their way. They drove through quiet neighborhoods where people mowed their lawns, trimmed their bushes, and read their papers on shaded porch swings. Along the way, a baby pointed from its stroller. A dog barked and ran circles in its yard, and a curious flock of birds gathered overhead, attracted by the supernatural being that was gliding just above the trees. Aside from that, the guardian angel went completely unnoticed as he followed the van. Soon they were driving along narrow roads, winding through the hills of Summerport. The ride through the countryside was relatively peaceful, all except for Jack's grumblings, which were typical for any ride that lasted longer than 10 minutes, and involved having to sit next to his sister, who at the moment happened to be staring at him as though he were on a shelf in a museum. "What's the matter with you?" Jack snarled. Katie just smiled and wondered when she should tell Jack about God, but judging by the look on his face, she could tell that now was not the time. Jack's anger continued to prowl around inside of him, and the presence of the angel above only made matters worse. An hour later, they arrived at the campgrounds early enough to find a perfect spot overlooking the bay. Dad spread their blanket in the shade of a big oak tree, while Katie unpacked the picnic basket. When all was done, Dad put Katie's kite together, then showed her how to hold the control handles and use the guidelines to make it do tricks. Then, just like that, he handed it over. With a gust of wind and a pull of the string, Katie watched in amazement as the kite rose into the air. "That's it, Pumpkin. You're doing great. Now you're on your own. Are you sure you can handle it?" "Uh-huh," Katie said, gazing up at the rainbow kite with a jerk of the shoulder and her tongue curled at the side of her mouth. Jack, however, was not as impressed, and followed Dad with his head down and hands jammed in his pockets as they headed to the paddle boats. Meanwhile, Mom chose a quiet moment to settle into her lawn chair and read a book in the shade of the tree. After a while, she looked over at Sophie, who was sitting on the blanket, surrounded by toys and staring up with the most peculiar expression. The infant watched the man, who was glistening like a shiny new coin, draped in white robes with his giant wings folded against his back. The angel stood next to Katie, watching the kite soar high above, and seemed perfectly content right where he was, until the baby pointed at him and yelled, "Stop!" Mom looked up at the invisible angel standing right in front of her and smiled up at the sky. "Yes, sweetheart, kite," she said with a pleasant smile, and went back to her book. The angel looked at the woman and the infant, then glanced around. There were other babies on other picnic blankets, staring and pointing. There was even a cocker spaniel yapping noisily, but the dog fell silent and shied away when the guardian spread his enormous wings and rose into the air, higher and higher, until he was so far above the park he was little more than a speck. From there he could watch Katie just as well and not attract any attention. Dozens of kites sailed above the windy hilltop. Some were larger and went higher. Some had long fancy tails that twirled like windmills. Some looked like caterpillars dancing on air, but none of them were as colourful as Katie's and could do fancy tricks. Katie didn't mind showing off just a little, and even made her kite fly sideways, which impressed the other kids greatly. "Wow," they said, and were sure that Katie was some kind of expert. That is, until she pointed her kite straight down, pulled back as hard as she could, and ploughed the nose of the kite into the ground like a dart. "It's time for a break," Katie said, then dropped the control handles and walked away with her head held high, as though she had meant to do it. When Dad returned with Jack, it was time to eat, and there was plenty of food. There was chicken and salad, chips and fries, burgers and hot dogs. But, even with a picnic on a beautiful sunny day, Jack could think of nothing but the travelling spell that wouldn't work. "Can we go home now?" he whined. "Nope," Dad said with a smile, and pat the boy on the back as though it were a good try, then handed him dessert, Mom's cherry cheesecake with strawberries and whipped cream swirled on top. Even Jack couldn't resist that. After lunch, just when Jack thought they were done, Dad rubbed his hands together and grinned. "How about we do some fishing?" Dad said with a wink, and grabbed their fishing poles. Jack gave a weak smile, as though it was absolutely the last thing he wanted to do. "You boys have fun," Mom said as the two plodded off together. With the sun high in the sky and another slice of dessert, Katie laid down for a nap and fell asleep next to the baby. When she awoke, nearly 2 hours had passed, and the setting sun peeked through the shady trees across the lake. Katie sat up, rubbing her eyes, and Mom looked up from her book. "I was beginning to think we were going to have to carry you to the car," she said. Katie looked around to see other families leaving as well. "Is it time to go already?" she asked, and took a nice long stretch. "Come on, help me clean up," Mom said, then placed a bookmark in the page where she was and started clearing off the blanket. Katie grabbed a few things and happened to notice the title of the book. Mom smiled. "The Exploration of Revelation." Katie repeated the title. "It's one of Nana's old books I found in the attic," Mom said. "What's it about?" Katie asked. "Well," Mom paused. It seemed to be a tough question. "It's all about the last book in the Bible, which talks about the Lord and his return." "What does it say?" It was another hard question that made Mom stop to think. "It says a lot of things, like, Jesus is called the King, and he rides a beautiful white horse." It was the image of the white horse that stuck with Katie. She smiled to herself as she tried to picture the animal and wanted to know more about the story, but the park was closing, Jack was grumpier than ever, and it was time to go. 10 minutes later they had piled everything back into the van, picnic basket, lawn chairs and all, and were headed home. Katie gazed out the window as they left the park behind, and thought about what her mom had said. She thought about the white horse, and when she closed her eyes, she could almost see it in her mind, glowing in golden rays of sunlight. What an amazing animal! Certainly the most beautiful creature anywhere in the whole universe, if it really existed. A moment later, a thought occurred to her that made her smile. "I wonder where the white horse could be right now. I bet it's guarded by angels in heaven, the white horse and the wonders of heaven." Too bad Jack couldn't think about things like that, Katy thought to herself, and smiled at the vision, then happened to open her eyes and stared in sheer amazement. 1 second later, and she would have missed it. Across the way, in a wide-open pasture, was a white horse, as grand and wonderful as anything Katy could imagine. "Stop!" Katy yelled so loud, Dad slammed on the brakes and woke her brother, who had drifted off in the back seat. Katy wasted no time and scrambled out of the car with her mother close behind. "What is it? What happened?" Jack said, rubbing his eyes and trying to sit up. When he saw it was only a horse and not something really interesting like a dragon or an ogre, he grumbled and went back to sleep. Katy and her mum crossed the quiet country road and went right up to the big white fence that surrounded the pasture. They stayed perfectly still as the wind rustled through the trees. The horse stood at a distance, grazing with its long white mane gently flowing. The animal was graceful and at the same time filled with power. Katy held onto her mother's arm as she watched the white horse and giggled with excitement. When she did, the animal looked up. It looked right at them, and Katy held her breath. The horse took a few curious steps in their direction. For a moment it seemed that it might come all the way up to them. It paused, gleaming in the sunlight, then turned and bolted away, its hooves thundering across the field. When it finally disappeared over the hillside, Katy clapped and yelped for joy. "I saw him, Mom! I saw him! That was great!" Mom looked at Katy seriously for a moment. "Honey, you know that's not the horse from the story," she said. Katy smiled and felt a little silly. "I know," she said, and had to remind herself that it really wasn't. It had all happened so quickly, first the story about a white horse, then to actually see one. Mom had to admit it was quite a coincidence. When they returned to the car, Katy peered out the window. "What do you think his name is?" she said. "Who?" Dad asked. "The white horse," Katy replied eagerly. Dad thought aloud as he started the van. "I don't know. Lightning? How about Comet?" Katy stared out the window as the van pulled off. "No, that sounds too made up," Katy said. Dad frowned and decided to keep his opinions to himself, then turned his attention back to the road. Katy looked behind them, hoping to get one last glimpse of the white horse. "I think I'll call him Snowball," she said. Dad glanced at Katy in the mirror, then looked at Mom with a smirk. "Snowball," he whispered. "Good name for a rabbit." "Goodbye, Snowball," Katy said as they drove away and the pasture disappeared among the trees. The experience had been nothing less than enchanting. The picnic was everything Katy expected, and the surprise of the white horse was a gift she would never forget. Jack, on the other hand, was miserable and hadn't gotten much sleep, since Katy wouldn't stop talking about the horse for the entire ride home. It was dark when they pulled into the driveway. Katy got the baby as Mom and Dad unpacked the car, and while everyone else was busy helping, Jack climbed out of the van and marched into the house like a grumpy old man who couldn't be bothered. The angel stood at the front door and watched the boy as he slumped past. After dinner, Jack still wore a frown, and the fact that Katy was in a great mood didn't help matters at all. When it was time for bed, Katy was still beaming a smile and should have known better, but just couldn't help herself. She skipped down the hall to Jack's room, threw open the door, and went straight inside. Numlock and the little winged creatures dove for cover as the little girl went right to Jack, who was seated at his table, pretending not to notice her until she rushed up behind him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and gave him a hug. "Hey, what's the matter with you?" Jack shouted and pushed her away as he jumped to his feet. When he turned around, Katy was standing there in her fleecy flannel nightgown and pink bunny slippers. "I just came to say good night," Katy said cheerfully. "Look, kid, just because you saw some stupid horse, don't get all mushy on me," he said, doing his best to be mean and utterly pig-headed. "Wasn't he wonderful?" Katy said, staring off dreamily. "It was like God just put him right there, in the perfect place, so we could see him." "What do you mean, we?" Jack said, and turned his back to her. The castle Bathenoir and its stone bridge lay in front of him, and Jack was in the middle of another game. "If you think I care about that stupid horse, you're cracked," he said. Jack placed the bronzed wizard under the stone bridge gently and muttered to himself as he settled into his chair and considered the dragon's next move. The monster would surely follow the wizard into the dark, and when he did... Katy peeked over Jack's shoulder and tried to be polite. "What's the matter? Didn't you—" Jack rounded on her with fists clenched and eyes glaring. "Can't you see I'm trying to do something here? I saw your dumb horse, okay? And I don't care. I don't care about your stupid fairy tales or your baby stories. None of it matters to me. Now quit bothering me, all right?" When Katy opened her mouth to speak, Jack yelled even louder. "Did you hear me? I said, go away!" he shouted, then turned around and pretended she was gone, just to make it perfectly clear. Katy hung her head and turned to leave. Just ahead of her, standing in the doorway, was the 7-foot angel, shining like the headlight of a freight train and glaring straight at Jack. This was the second time the angel had witnessed the boy's ill-mannered behavior. Katy paused, then turned and stood in front of her invisible guardian. "Tomorrow is church," she reminded Jack, but the boy just stayed hunched over the table with his back to her. "Good night," Katy said with a whimper. Again there was no response. But before Katy could leave, Dad stormed into the room and walked right through the angel, which parted like smoke. He pushed his way past Katy and went straight for Jack. Dad had heard everything from downstairs, and after Jack's rude behavior and selfish attitude all day long, the boy was in big trouble. Katy turned away and sulked back to her room with the angel close behind. Dad's voice echoed down the hall as he yelled at Jack and scolded him for being so mean. When Katy climbed into bed, the angel took his position in the middle of the room, while Katy stared at the ceiling and listened. Jack was really getting an earful now, and she could hear him pleading. But she was... From the sound of things, Jack wasn't making a very good case. After a while it got quiet, and Katy listened for any sound at all. A moment later there was a knock at the door. Katy sat up and was surprised to see her dad standing in the doorway. "Katy, Jack's got something he'd like to say to you," he said with a stern voice, then reached over and pulled Jack into view. He held the boy by the back of his collar, which made Jack look like a stiff-necked puppet. He looked at Katy with a nasty scowl on his face, and his lips drawn tight. His mouth twitched and wiggled as though something was struggling to get out. Then, "Sorry," he said, and winced like the word had thorns. Dad released him, and Jack walked away, grumbling and full of resentment. Suddenly Dad looked tired and worn. "This wasn't the way I wanted the day to end," he said. Katy forced a smile. "That's okay, Dad. It's not your fault." Dad leaned into the room a little. "I love you, Pumpkin. Sweet dreams," he whispered and blew her a kiss. When he went to close the door, he remembered that Katy liked it open, then pushed it halfway, smiled once more, and walked away. The hallway light went out, and Katy laid back in bed. The angel could feel her sadness, but knew there was no excuse for the boy's behavior. With Katy safely tucked in, the angel took one last look around the room, smiled at the little child of God, then vanished in the moonlight. As usual, Katy said her prayers. She prayed for her mom and dad. She prayed for her little sister, but most of all, she prayed for Jack. Like all her prayers, it was short and sweet. She prayed that God would not be angry with Jack, and that God would help her brother to forget about magic. She felt like she was praying for a miracle, and had no earthly idea that she was about to get one. Katy rolled over and snuggled her cheek against the pillow, and just before she closed her eyes, she happened to glance at the door. When she did, something made her smile. The door reminded her of the silly words Jack had said over and over again when he had tried to cast his spell. She remembered the words because they made such a funny rhyme. In fact, it sounded so silly Katy couldn't resist, and said the words softly so that they barely whispered from her lips. "Dig-a-hoo, big-a-hoo, ba-la, boogie-ya." Katy smirked at the ridiculous-sounding words, and doubted they were even words at all. Then, in the perfect stillness, she looked at her bedroom door, which was half open, exactly the way her dad had left it. In the dark, the door was pointed straight at her, and had become a thin line, so that all she could see was the edge of the door and the doorknobs on either side. When she moved her head one way, she could begin to see more of the front of the door. When she moved the other way, she could see more of the back. Katy decided to play a little game and see if she could make it so that she could see neither the front nor back of the door at all. That would make the edge of the door look the thinnest. With her head on the pillow, Katy moved ever so slightly until the door looked the thinnest that it possibly could. And just when she thought she must be looking right at the precise and exact edge of her bedroom door, there was an instant flash, like a burst of sunlight that filled the room for a split second and was gone. Katy sprang up in bed and sat there in the darkness, staring and blinking. She held her breath and rubbed her eyes, then tried to stay perfectly still, wondering what had happened and where the flash of light had come from. Perhaps a car had gone by, or maybe lightning. No, she thought. She had seen headlights pass across her ceiling. She had seen lightning light up her room. This was neither of those things. Katy sat there in the dark, trembling, waiting for her heart to stop racing, and tried to calm down. After a while she convinced herself that she had imagined whatever it was. The only problem was the flash of light had left the faint image of a line dancing in her eyes, and she could still see it. As Katy stared into the empty space in front of her, it was that faint sliver of light that reminded her of the strange words which Jack recited to her, the words that accompanied the travelling spell. "Set ye door at the nor-world sliver of a splinter's eye, to ye dwelling place, then rest ye brow at the spot." Although Katy couldn't remember them exactly, whether she knew it or not, she could not have performed the spell any better if she tried. "Set ye door at your dwelling place" meant you were to point the edge of your door to the place where you slept. That's exactly what Katy's dad had done when he left the room. "Rest your brow at the spot" simply meant to lie down. "Of a splinter's eye" was the hard part. That meant you had to look at the door just the right way and find the exact spot where the other world would open up after you said the magic words. And that is precisely what Katy had done by accident. Katy wondered if she might be dreaming, but it was the flash of light that had caused her to sit up in bed, and here she was, sitting up. When she had calmed down, she half suspected that the light had come from the edge of the door itself. After all, it was in the shape of a long, thin line, and that had to be more than coincidence. Katy took a deep breath, and when her heart wasn't pounding quite so hard anymore, she decided to lie back down. She placed her head on the pillow, feeling more awake than ever as she tried to find the edge of the door again. She moved this way and that, and felt a little silly when nothing happened. She looked right at the door and studied its shape just like she had when she first laid down. She moved just a little. Nothing. She moved again. The line of the door got thinner, but still nothing. She moved ever so slightly, what seemed like the smallest fraction of the tiniest part of an inch. The flash of light was blinding, but this time Katy didn't move. She held stone still, squinting at the silvery light that was once the edge of her door. It beamed brightly, but cast no light in the room at all. With the rest of her bedroom covered in darkness, it was like looking through a narrow slit in a wall on a bright sunny day. "Set ye door at the nor-world sliver." Was this a sliver of the nor-world she was seeing? And where on earth was that? Katy stared at the thing, wanting to get closer, wanting to sit up, but she dared not move for fear the light would disappear again. She watched the thread of light beaming in the darkness, and after a short while her neck grew tired. She had to move, and shifted very slightly, but instead of going out the light shone bright and steady. Katy moved very slowly as she sat up, then pulled the covers back and climbed out of bed, never taking her eyes off the light. Slowly she put on her robe, then patted the floor with her feet, till she found her slippers. When she was ready, she started forward to get a better look, fully expecting the light to disappear at any moment. But the closer she got, the more she thought she could make something out. With a few more steps, she could actually begin to see into the narrow space of light, and knew that what she had suspected was true. This was more than a light. It was indeed a thin sliver of a door to something or somewhere. Katy stared right at it as hard as she could, and although she could only see a tiny slice, she suddenly knew what it was she was looking at. What's more, she knew where it was. Katy tried to stay calm as she walked closer and closer, longing to get a better look. She crept forward with her arms outstretched and teetered like a tight rope walker on a string. The closer she got, the more she feared it would all disappear. Instead, the opening seemed to grow wider as her curiosity drew her forward and she stared in wonder. When she finally crossed the dark floor, Katy was bathed in light. She could hear birds chirping and the rustling of leaves as a cool breeze blew across her face. Standing there, she paused for the briefest of moments, wondering whether she was dreaming or awake, then tried to remind herself to tell Jack that his traveling spell actually worked. And without another thought of the past or future, she stepped through the opening and disappeared from her quiet bedroom and the world she called home. A moment later, the guardian angel returned with a flaming sword in hand, then rushed to the magic portal only to see it shut before his eyes. In an instant, he became fully visible, and Katy's room was suddenly ablaze with his heavenly light. The 7-foot angel grabbed the edge of Katy's door, searing the paint with his touch, and clenched his teeth in anger. The little girl had stepped out of this world and entered another, and now that she was gone, the powers of darkness had outsmarted him, and there was nothing he could do. The warrior of God stood in the earthly realm and slowly looked toward heaven. To follow the child would not only require the permission of God, it would call for another guardian that was far greater than he. With that, the angel lowered his head and disappeared. When Katy stepped into the light, she was standing at the edge of a pasture with a large wooden fence behind her. Beyond the fence was a narrow country road. She had seen this place before. It was the very same spot she had been to earlier that day, the place where she had seen the white horse. Only now she was standing on the other side of the fence, with the pasture stretching out in front of her. Katy looked out from the shade of the tall trees and blinked a few times to make sure she wasn't seeing things. There in the distance was the white horse standing in the middle of the green pasture just as she remembered him. Katy stared silently. The horse was a good ways off, nearly 50 yards. With one step, then another, Katy started forward slowly and found herself tiptoeing through the grass as though she was sneaking up on a mouse. Just then the horse raised his head and looked right at her. Katy stopped and giggled, then crept forward again. If only she could get close enough. One touch was all she wanted. One gentle stroke of his white mane. If only the horse would let her. And then he bolted. With a few long strides he had doubled the distance, and Katy yelled, "Snowball, wait!" Amazingly, the animal paused and turned to look back. The horse seemed to know its name. Katy laughed at the thought. But laughter turned to surprise when the beautiful white horse reared back on its hind legs, then turned and galloped away. "Wait!" she cried again, and watched the horse disappear in the row of trees at the edge of the clearing. Katy ran across the pasture, then ducked inside the forest without a care for where she was or what lay beyond the darkened woods ahead.